On my daughter's 8th birthday, my mother once again decided to show everyone who was boss. She stood by the festive table, covered in necklaces and rings, as if it weren't a children's party but a coronation, and burst into loud laughter when Bella, my little one, my quiet, kind girl, turned to me and called me Mom. Her laughter rang out so loudly, so angrily and coldly, that even the guests fell silent for a second, but my mother, as if enjoying the attention, had already waved her hand and, without looking at Bella, began handing out gifts to all the other granddaughters, deliberately ignoring the one for whom the whole celebration was all about. My father, as usual, sat with an inscrutable face, pretending not to notice, and my sister, Olga, just shrugged and continued taking pictures of the cake on her phone. No one said anything, no one even glanced in Bella's direction. I didn't scream, there was no point. The words she spoke bounced off the wall like peas, but something shifted inside, like a fragile mechanism cracking, and I realized, I couldn't just endure this anymore. I took action. And before we continue, I want to thank you. I'm so glad you're watching this video on my channel. Please write in the comments if you hear stories like this. Do you remember someone from your life? Maybe yourself, someone close, or just a moment when everything suddenly changed. Tell me the first thing that came to mind. The next morning, everything looked like it was just another day. The sky was clear, the wind was swaying the lilac branches, and I stood by the window with a cup of cold coffee, thinking how strange it is that days like these can sometimes be turning points. Mom herself suggested throwing a party for Bella. Let me do it, she said then, with that same condescending expression that made me feel like a 15-year-old girl again, unworthy of her approval. I thought it was a step toward halfway. That perhaps her words hinted at forgiveness, some belated remorse, an attempt to make peace with her granddaughter. How wrong I was. She scheduled the party for 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right in the middle of my shift. You'll be home by 5 anyway, she said in a tone that brooked no argument. We'll keep her occupied until then, she added, and I, foolishly, believed her. At the time, it seemed reasonable, almost caring. Hope, it turns out, can blind even those who've been burned before. When I finally turned onto our street and pulled into the driveway, the colorful lights were already pulsing in the windows, and laughter drifted from the half-open door, loud, shrill, joyful, the kind of noise always associated with childhood and happiness. The air was thick with the scent of cake, frosting, balloon rubber, and something sweet, cloying, almost suffocating. The living room was chaos, kids running around, 5 cousins in lopsided paper hats arguing over who would get the last slice of pizza, my sister sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone, my father in his usual corner chair pretending to read messages, and only my mother, like the prom queen, perched in the center, directing everything, with gestures, glances, and short commands. Everyone looked busy, animated, happy, everyone, except one. Where's Bella? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but I felt everything inside me tense, like a string. Olga didn't even look up. In the bathroom, probably, she said, too quickly, too casually. Something inside me trembled. I walked down the hallway. It was quiet, cold, and only the muffled sounds of laughter came from somewhere in the living room. I knocked once and pushed the door. Bella was sitting on the floor, her legs tucked under her, in her yellow lace dress, which she had chosen herself a week ago, dreaming of being a darling, as she said. The dress was now wrinkled, her hat was askew, her eyes were red, her eyelashes stuck together. Hearing me, she looked up and tried to smile, that cautious, forced smile children use to cover up a grudge when they're afraid they'll be misunderstood again. What happened, baby? I asked, kneeling down next to her. She fiddled with the ribbon on her wrist. Grandma laughed at me, she said quietly. I called you Mom, and she laughed. She said I shouldn't say that you're not my real mom. The room seemed to tilt, the air thinned. I looked at her and felt the heat rising under my skin, my pulse pounding in my temples. She said, Bella continued, almost whispering, that maybe I'll change my mind, that people change their minds sometimes. I wanted to scream, but I just reached out and took her hand. Look at me, I said, I'm your mother, always, no one can decide that but us. Her chin trembled, but she nodded, then she added, barely audible. She gave everyone presents, and she told me she might buy me one next year, when I become really family. I swallowed, trying not to show how my hands were shaking. I took a slow, deliberate breath until the dizziness subsided. Okay, I said, let's wash our faces, okay? Together, we washed her face, carefully smoothed her hair, and found her small notebook, the same one she always carried with her, covered with childish drawings, plans, and lists of good things to remember. We stood silently and walked to her room, step by step, unhurriedly, as if every second between us required caution, lest it shatter the fragile peace I'd just so painstakingly regained. She climbed onto the bed, as she always does, carefully, out of habit, pulling her knees to her chest. She placed her notebook next to her and ran her finger down one of the pages, as if checking that everything was in place, that everything in her little world still belonged to her. I sat down next to her, just to make sure she felt safe again, that her breathing had become even, that her shoulders were no longer shaking with suppressed tears. When her eyes began to slowly close, I realized I could leave for a moment, just for a minute. I didn't do anything wrong, she muttered, almost falling asleep, but her voice trembled as if the words burnt her lips. I know, I replied quietly, trying to keep every note of pain from my voice. You did the right thing, my dear. I turned off the lamp, leaving the door slightly ajar so she could hear the soft sounds from the hallway, that melody of household noises that soothes children better than any lullaby. When I returned to the living room, the world was ablaze with 1,000 chaotic lights again. Wrappers, balloons, and plastic cups littered the floor, and the cousins had launched into a noisy video game tournament, squealing and arguing over who had won. My mother sat back in her chair with a glass of punch, a smug look on her face, the same one that made my insides clench, and my father, as always, hid behind his phone screen, pretending none of this concerned him. I stood by the door long enough for someone to notice my presence. No one did. The party's over, I said calmly, but my voice was drowned out by the hubbub. No one paid attention. The party's over, I repeated louder, more clearly, with emphasis. My sister lazily looked up from her phone and smirked. Oh, relax, Lucia, they're almost done, she said with the condescension I'd learned by heart since childhood. I crossed the room, past the couch, past my father's shadow, and without hesitation, pulled the plug from the outlet. The screen went black, the air froze, the children groaned in unison, someone let out an indignant sob, but the silence that followed was almost beautiful, like a breath of fresh air after a long period of suffocation. I said, I repeated more quietly, the party's over, everyone needs to leave. Mom blinked, looking up at me, and for the first time all evening, her lips twitched not with smugness but with mild bewilderment. Lucia, what happened now? She said, and that one word, my name, spoken with the same intonation as in childhood, as if I were a misbehaving girl again, somehow struck the hardest. Chairs creaked, someone began gathering up wrapping paper. My sister muttered that I was being dramatic, as always, but she still called her children and hurriedly pulled their jackets on. A few minutes later, the room emptied, leaving behind the smell of frosting, warm candle wax, and a strange feeling of emptiness, as if the holiday had deflated like a balloon. When the door closed behind the last cousin, only my parents remained. Mom crossed her arms over her chest, her lips twitching in a slight, almost triumphant smile. We're not leaving, she said, we live here. I didn't answer, I didn't trust myself, my voice, my hands, my thoughts. I simply turned and walked back to my daughter's room, feeling my father's heavy sigh behind me and my mother's quiet, almost insulted whisper. What's wrong with her? As if I'd gone crazy, as if they hadn't just trampled on what little we had. Bella was still awake. She sat cross-legged, drawing tiny flowers in her notebook, even, neat, as if each petal were an attempt to hold the world in order. I sat down next to her, on the edge of her bed, brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, and suddenly felt something shift quietly within me, like an invisible mechanism clicking in a lock. Enough pretending everything was fine, enough explaining, making excuses, waiting for one of them to understand. Stop letting them define what family means. I sat and watched her breathe, calmly, deeply, trustingly, and whispered to myself that I would never let them hurt her again, never, no matter what was at stake. Something changed that night, and life as we knew it began to quietly but inexorably crumble. I used to think that every family simply had a favorite, that's how it works, that's how it happens, it's no big deal, but in ours, it was different. In ours, the favorite wasn't just loved, they built a world around him. He was Antonio, my older brother, the firstborn, the pride of the family, a project we'd invested everything into: tutors, clubs, trips, summer programs, a new laptop, personal mentors. Everything for him. If he got anything less than an A storm would erupt. If he won a medal, the house would shine. In our house, love was measured by report cards. And then there was Paula, the youngest, the untouchable. She didn't have to try, didn't have to earn attention, she just had it. If she missed curfew, she was free. If she forgot to do her homework, she was creative. If she lied, she was expressive. Whenever Paula wanted something, a dress, a trip, a new phone, even just attention, Mom always found a way to explain why it wasn't just a whim but important for her self-confidence. I heard this over and over again until I realized that in our house, self-confidence was measured by how much money you spent and how many approving glances you received, and I was average, reliable, inexpensive. The background noise in their family symphony, that quiet note you thought you could do without. When Antonio needed quiet time to study, I kept Paula busy so she wouldn't disturb him. When my mother was tired and needed someone to talk to, I'd sit and listen, nodding the way adults nod to children complaining of fatigue, gently, without interrupting, and always without the right to respond. But when I asked for something for myself, she never had the time, the money, or even the pretense of sympathy. One day, in high school, I timidly asked for a math tutor. My mother smiled, as if I'd said something funny. "Darling, you're not cut out for this kind of pressure, be happy with your B." It sounded like consolation, but it turned out to be a death sentence. It was the first time I realized that some children receive investment, while others receive excuses. From that moment on, I did what all children do when they're overlooked. I became useful, I helped, I substituted, I reconciled, I consoled, and everyone called it maturity. It looked like independence, but in reality, it was just simple survival, and it worked, until it didn't. The years passed, and the pattern didn't change. Antonio became exactly how he was raised: driven, ambitious, perpetually busy, always on the go. With 2 children and endless business trips, Paula remained the same, just a grown-up version of herself. 3 children, constant drama, calls in the middle of the night asking to come over, help, babysit, save, and I, still reliable, still helpful, still the one people count on when everyone else can't. When my parents' finances collapsed, no one was surprised. They'd invested everything they had in Antonio's education and the down payment on Paula's house. Somehow, they hadn't put a penny aside for themselves, as if old age was just something they were going to have to take care of. And when the moment came when they really needed help, they didn't call their brother or sister, they called me, because being responsible, as it turns out, automatically means being obligated. "We won't be staying long," Mom said into the phone, "just a few months." And, of course, I agreed, because that's what reliable people do, those who don't want to disappoint anyone, those who can't say no, the one people call boring behind their backs, but who people run to when the world is falling apart. They moved into the guest room. Mom said, "You won't even notice we're here." That promise lasted exactly a week. 7 days later, half my kitchen was already remodeled for convenience. Dad had expressed his opinion on my grocery budget, and by the end of the 2nd month, the house began to echo with their voices again, the ones I'd once fled, hoping to start my own life. Everything around me seemed to remind me that, no matter how hard I tried, these were still their rules, their habits, their order. I told myself I needed to be patient, that they were my parents, that this was temporary, that this was just a difficult phase. Part of me still clung to the naive hope that maybe now, seeing the kind of home I'd created, the kind of life I was living, they'd finally see me not as a backup plan, not as a reliable daughter, but as a woman capable of making her own decisions. but instead, they noticed dust on the ceiling fan. When my husband and I decided to adopt a child, it all started again. My mother froze, as if she'd heard something impossible. Then she said slowly, "You're still young enough to try again." I told her calmly that we couldn't, that my husband couldn't have children. She knew this, had known it for a long time, but when I said it out loud, her face turned stony. She shrugged slightly. "Then maybe you should think about finding someone who can," she said, returning to her cup of coffee, as if we were discussing something like the weather. I looked at her, waiting for her to understand what she'd just said, but she didn't. She simply continued stirring her coffee, with the same calm motion, and then, as if deciding to soften the blow, she added, "Or find a donor, you can still have one of your own." It wasn't concern, it was control. Control over how I live, who I love, who I have the right to call family. Anything, just not adoption. Anything, just not a stranger's child in their family. After that, I stopped explaining, I just lived. And then Bella came along, 6 years old, quiet, with big, wary eyes and a stubborn chin. She called me Mom 2 weeks later, and in that moment, I felt like my heart would burst with tenderness. She fused with us as if she'd always been there, as if she'd just been waiting for us to find her. My parents didn't know what to do with her at first. They weren't overtly cruel, no, just cautious, as if she might accidentally ruin the furniture with her mere presence. My mother asked me one night, after Bella had already fallen asleep, in a quiet voice that held not curiosity but something caustic, measured, like someone who already knows their question will hurt. "Don't you think it's strange that she started calling you Mom so quickly?" she said, looking at me over her teacup, her eyes shining with cold interest. "Isn't that a warning sign? Doesn't it mean she's being too clingy?" She said it as if she were talking not about a child but about an object, a stranger, devoid of feelings and memory, not about my daughter but about an accidental guest who had stayed in the house longer than expected. I answered her calmly, although everything inside was burning, "It means she finally feels safe." Mom smiled, that same forced smile of hers, the one that always exuded both pity and coldness, and, shaking her head, said, "Or maybe she's just saying what she thinks people want to hear." This phrase hit me harder than I expected. I felt something between us crack completely, as if she wasn't simply doubting me, but seeking confirmation that she was right. Proof that Bella and I were insincere, feigned, temporary. After this conversation, her interest in my daughter began to resemble a cold medical examination. Short questions, casually thrown out, without concern. "Is she behaving well?" she'd ask. "Is she too attached to you?" Mom would say, as if attachment were a disease, not the very essence of childhood love. 2 years later, we were already in the final stages of adoption. All that remained were signatures and stamps, and I felt a quiet joy blossom in my chest, as if everything was finally falling into place. But Mom still called it paperwork, as if it were some bureaucratic triviality of no importance, as if we were pursuing a strange hobby. And then one morning, over coffee, she said, "Let me throw her birthday party this year." There was a solemn pride in her voice, as if she'd discovered a new level of generosity. I was surprised, but, as always, I wanted to believe that maybe this was a step forward, that maybe she wanted to be the grandmother she seemed to be on Christmas cards, the one who baked cookies and read fairy tales. So I agreed. I told myself it was progress. In reality, I just desperately wanted to believe that people could change, that a mother, even one like mine, could learn to love unconditionally. Hope is a dangerous thing. It blinds us to the obvious. That evening, when Bella was already asleep, tucked under her blanket, I sat in silence and waited for my husband. When he came in, I looked at him and said, "They're leaving." He paused at the threshold, not immediately understanding. "Who's leaving?" "My parents," I replied. "I'm evicting them." He blinked, trying to process what he'd heard. "You can do that?" I googled it twice. I said wearily but confidently, "So, yes." He put the keys on the table, took a deep breath, and quietly asked, "What did they do this time?" I looked at him and almost laughed in frustration. "They told Bella I might get her back." He straightened, his eyes widening. "You're kidding." "I wish," I replied. He ran a hand over his face, then smiled faintly. The way men can smile when they can't think of anything else to do. Okay, what's the plan? 30 days notice, written, signed, laminated, if you want. He laughed briefly. I'll turn on the printer. We sat side by side at the table, typing these words together. 30 days, politely worded, 1 page, but it weighed like a stone. When the printer hummed, it was the most honest sound this house had made in years, the sound of agreement, of determination, of liberation. The next morning, before dropping Bella off at school, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table. Mom was stirring sugar in her coffee, and Dad, as usual, was hiding behind the newspaper, pretending to read the news. "What is this?" Mom asked, without looking. "An eviction notice," I said, 30 days. She looked at me for a second, then laughed, loudly, with surprise, as if I'd shown her a coupon for a sweepstakes. "Very funny," she said. I didn't smile. "This is not a joke." Dad frowned and put the newspaper down. "Lucia, this is ridiculous." I looked at them both and said calmly, "It's funny how you think you can destroy everything and still remain saintly." At that moment, Bella entered the room, rubbing her eyes, and Mom turned to her with that same cold expression I'd known since childhood. "We're family," she said. "Exactly," I replied, taking Bella's hand. We left the house, and the air outside felt unusually fresh, as if I could breathe for the first time in a long time. When we returned that afternoon, the envelope was gone from the table, but nothing in the house had changed, only the silence had become different, thick, sticky, heavy, so thick that, walking down the hallway, I could almost physically feel it clinging to my legs. That evening, they waited for me in the living room, sitting next to each other, upright, almost in sync, as if they'd rehearsed every word, every glance. Beforehand, the TV was off, the phones were put away, and the air was thick with silence, foreboding something unpleasant. I walked in, and my mother, her hands in her lap, said in her calm, measured voice, the kind she used with doctors or priests, "Can we talk?" I nodded. "Go ahead." She took a deep breath, as if about to lecture me. "We just don't understand why you're doing this." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You told my daughter she's not part of the family," I replied calmly, though inside I was seething. "That's enough to understand." Dad cleared his throat, as if about to interject, and said in his low, heavy voice, "You're taking that out of context." I raised an eyebrow. "Context?" I repeated, "You mean there's a proper context for telling a child I can have her back?" "We were worried about you," Mom said quickly, as if afraid I'd cut her off. "You don't know what you're getting into. Raising someone else's child is not yours." I finished for her. "She's mine." Mom pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. "You're emotional," she said coldly, emphasizing the last word. I looked her straight in the eye. "I'm a mother." Dad sighed, as if I'd just shattered something fragile, his expectations, his belief that his daughter would always obey. "We just wanted to protect you from making a mistake," he said wearily, and the words echoed the same old sentiment, patronizing, uninvited, devaluing. "You protected me from everything except the most important," I said. "From you." There was silence for a few seconds. Mom looked away first, then I said, "You have 30 days, and went upstairs without looking back. For the next week, they didn't speak to me directly, they simply lived louder. Cabinet doors slammed a little harder, the television sounded at the edge of tolerance, even the clatter of dishes was somehow demonstrative, as if they were measuring their presence by decibels. Mom baked cookies and left them on the kitchen counter, a gesture of reconciliation from someone who didn't understand exactly how they were at fault. Dad, without asking, rearranged the garage, as if to show that the house was still his. I found 2 of Bella's toys in a box labeled trash. They didn't even try to hide them. Bella, of course, noticed everything. Children always sense when something is wrong in the air. She would whisper to me at night before bed, "Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at me?" And every time I'd answer, "No, honey," but she didn't believe it, and neither did I. On the 5th day, there was a knock on the door, no warning, no ringing of the bell. I opened it, and there stood Paula, my younger sister, in the hallway, in an immaculate coat, with that expression on her face that always meant she was there to judge, not listen. "Wow," she said, walking inside, as if the house still belonged to her, "you really did that." I tried to keep my voice even. "Coffee?" She shook her head. "I got a call, they're heartbroken." I smiled faintly. "I'm sure, losing rent-free is tough." Paula raised an eyebrow. "Wow, listen to yourself, these are your parents, they're adults." "The adults who told my daughter she wasn't mine," I said. Her lips twitched. "They were just worried about you," she repeated in her mother's tone. "Everyone thinks you rushed this adoption." I bowed my head. "Everyone? Who's everyone?" "Well, family, everyone means you." I felt a weariness welling up inside me, thick and oppressive. "I have 3 children," she said, as if presenting proof. "I know how hard it is." I nodded. "Then you know better than to direct your frustration at the child." Her face tightened. "You should take care of them, you're older, you have more bedrooms," she said sharply, like a sentence. "I can't." I looked at her. "Why?" "My house is full, my husband would never agree." "You have one child, the one who..." She paused, her eyes sliding to the side. "Which what?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Uneven," she blurted out. I froze. "Uneven?" I repeated. Her face turned pale. "Forget it." "I can't," I said quietly. "You said that out loud." She grabbed her bag, as if she wanted to erase her presence. "You're unbearable." "Thanks for coming," I said as she was already flying out the door. It slammed shut with a bang, making the frame shake. Something creaked softly upstairs. Bella winced, and I heard her light footsteps on the floor. Another mess that would have to be cleaned up later. That evening, the house was finally quiet, that real quiet, not tainted with anger, but pure and tired. Bella sat at the kitchen table, coloring a picture of a cat wearing a crown. The crown was crooked, and the cat looked angry, almost menacing. She looked up and asked, "Are they still angry?" I looked at her and said, "I don't know, maybe they're just confused." "Will they go away?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. Bella nodded with quiet satisfaction and returned to her drawing, and I watched her hand confidently move the pencil, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe this was just the beginning. For several minutes, the house was so silent that the only sound was the scratch of Bella's pencil, leaving soft, gray lines on the paper. Upstairs, there were no footsteps, no voices, not the muted hum of the television, which I had grown accustomed to as a backdrop to my perpetual discontent. Everything was still, even the air seemed to stand still, watching. It was the first real calm in months, thin, fragile, like ice in the spring sun. I stood leaning against the doorframe and thought, this must be the end. How wrong I was, the worst hadn't even begun. The week after that ill-fated party passed almost peacefully, almost. A strange semblance of normality reigned in the house. Conversations about the weather, freshly washed laundry, the smell of coffee that Mom still filled the kitchen with in the mornings, as if nothing had happened. But beneath that surface, something smoldered quietly. The tension was thick, like an invisible smoke, hanging between us. And when, 7 days later, there was a sudden knock on the door, strong, sharp, shaking the glass, I already knew we wouldn't have any peace. I stood at the stove, stirring the soup, and for a second I even thought my parents had locked the door again, forgetting their keys. But looking out the window, I saw a dark sedan with government license plates in the driveway. My heart sank painfully. When I opened the door, a woman in a gray coat stood there, her mouth pursed tightly, holding a clipboard. Behind her stood a uniformed officer, tall and still, with the expression of someone accustomed to witnessing the misfortunes of others. "Mrs. Thompson?" the woman asked, stepping forward. "Yes. I'm from Child Protective Services. We've received a report about your daughter." All sounds in the house instantly vanished. Even the refrigerator seemed to have stopped humming. Behind me, I heard quiet footsteps on the stairs, and my mother's familiar breathing. "Oh, my God," she said, with that same false surprise I'd recognize in 1,000, "what's going on?" The social worker smiled politely, but it was a smile devoid of any sympathy. "Don't worry, I just need to talk to everyone in the house." I stepped aside. "Come in." The next 40 minutes dragged on like torture disguised as polite tea. Bella was led to the guest room. Through the half-open door, I heard her voice rise and fall, quiet, cautious, as if she were trying to say the right words, not realizing that everything she said could backfire on us. Every time she laughed softly, a brief surge of relief would flash through me, followed immediately by a wave of fear. Then it was my turn. The questions were familiar, reserved, as if pre-recorded. Where does she go to school? What does she eat? Do you have any medical records? I had all the answers ready, because that's who I am, the kind of woman who has everything under control, with files neatly organized in her closet, and her head full of vaccination dates, school meetings, and psychological evaluations. The social worker nodded, making notes, her face stony. Then she asked to see Bella's room. I opened the door with a gesture resembling presenting evidence. The bed was made, the toys folded away, a neat stack of notebooks on the desk, and an open notepad, its pages covered with drawings of cats in crooked crowns. She loves to draw, the woman said. She's good at it, I added hastily, much better than me. Her smile warmed a little, but the warmth didn't reach her eyes. When she left to talk to my parents, I remained in the hallway, listening. The words were illegible, but I recognized the intonations. My mother turned on her soft, almost sing-song voice, the same one she used with doctors and salespeople, and my father added his quiet, confident whisper, filled with the weight of experience. They were creating the image they needed: polite, caring, reasonable, people who just wanted to help. Time dragged on. The coffee I'd poured had gone cold and turned bitter. The vanilla scent from the cookies on the counter now tasted sour. I sat on the stairs, my hands clasped, imagining every possible version of the story they could tell. That I was tired, that I couldn't cope, that Bella was unmanageable, that I was too emotional. It would all sound so convincing coming from them. Finally, the door opened. The worker stood in the hallway, with the same neutral smile that could mean anything and nothing at the same time. "Thank you for taking the time," she said. "We'll contact you when everything is finalized." No assurances, no hint of faith, just a professional distance, cold and impeccable. When the door closed behind her, I turned around, and saw my parents exchange glances. It was a brief but meaningful look, tiny, smug, triumphant. And then, in that second, I realized, it was them. They called, they started it all. That evening, I found them in the living room. They were sitting in front of the TV, watching some stupid game show, laughing at the right parts, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't ruined my life with one phone call, as if they hadn't touched what I loved most. "You called Child Protective Services," I said, feeling the words curl in my throat, and Mom immediately lowered her voice, feigning confusion, as if she'd just been given an awkward diagnosis. "Sorry, we didn't mean to," she muttered, but beneath the politeness, I heard her old sly tone and saw the faces that knew how to play the game, and Dad even chuckled softly, as if it were just a misunderstanding. If someone contacted them, maybe they were worried. He tried to justify himself, but I repeated slowly, as if teaching a lesson, "People are talking, or was it you?" Mom put her hand to her chest and, feigning offense at her own daughter, said, "Lucia, you're paranoid. We would never do anything like that." I looked at her intently and calmly said, "You've already made things worse," and at that moment she had no answer. "You're leaving," I said quietly, and her smirk turned into a caustic echo. "Before 30 days? Ha." I still tried to maintain my composure. "You can't do that," she said, and I could see she was enjoying it, but I answered coldly, "I can, and I will." I turned off the TV, went into my room, and locked myself in there, not giving them a word. I lay awake all night, listening to the clock tick and expecting to hear Bella crying at any moment, but she remained silent, and that silence was broken by my thoughts. The next day, while my parents were at the store, I methodically carried out my promise. I changed the Wi-Fi password, put the TV remote away, printed out a new notice, this one marked 1 week, and stuck it on their door like a sign at the scene of a crime. I taped a list of rules to the fridge: kitchen and upstairs bathroom only, no guests, no group gatherings. It wasn't revenge, it was restraint, pure and cold necessity. When they returned and saw the note, Mom called me by the name of a mischievous child, but I didn't answer. She burst into the kitchen, calling it childish, and I merely pointed out that I had learned from the best, from those who had once taught me patience, and said, "You ceased to be parents the moment you endangered my child." She took this as an insult. She muttered that I would be sorry, and went upstairs. The internet shutdown probably hit their comfort harder than the paper notifications. The house instantly ceased to be the arena of their constant noise. No more loud TV, no more mocking comments from the couch, and Bella, amazingly, hummed to herself as she colorized, and in those moments, it seemed to me that the order I'd been striving for so long had given her a chance to breathe. But then the phone vibrated. An unknown number. The voice on the other end said calmly and too evenly, "We're still reviewing the notes, we might need to continue," and there was no understanding in that voice, only protocol. I thanked her mechanically, hung up, and stared at the phone, expecting an explosion. My husband tried to reassure me. "They'll figure it out soon," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and I barely slept that night, because every rustle seemed like the footsteps of strangers at the door, and it seemed as if every car passing might stop and leave a new disaster at the threshold. 2 days later, the silence in the house was broken. My parents went to visit friends. They were gone for several hours, and by evening, a barrage of social media notifications sounded on my phone. I opened Facebook and saw a photo of our hallway, boxes neatly stacked against the wall, the caption, "Abandoned by their own daughter," and a slightly mocking note. "Some people forget who raised them." The comments were filled with pity emojis, indignant ahas from people who hadn't spoken to me in years, and Aunt Linda's sentimental reproaches. I scrolled through it all, my palms shaking, and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Of course they did it. It wasn't enough for them to humiliate me in my own home, now they were trying to condemn me publicly. They needed an audience, so I wrote one post, just one, short, almost restrained, without big words, without the usual reproaches. Just the pure, neat truth that needed no embellishment. At my daughter's birthday party, my parents humiliated her in front of everyone, with the cold grace they'd mastered their entire lives, as if hurting and being right were their innate talent. And then, not satisfied with that, they called Child Protective Services, leaving false allegations stitched together. From envy and petty resentment, the investigation was still ongoing, and I stood my ground, defending Bella the way I'd perhaps once dreamed someone would defend me. No insults, no details, just the truth, so quiet it was almost physical. And then, within an hour, the tide had turned. Comments poured in, words of support, dozens of faces from the past who suddenly found the courage to say, "Well done. Proud of you for standing up for her." Even an old family friend sent a message, short but precise, like a knife under the skin. "We all knew how they treated you." By midnight, Mom's post was gone, erased as if it had never existed, and the silence that reigned online was louder than any of their voices. A week later, I heard the wheels of wooden suitcases clacking on the tiles downstairs. I didn't go down, there was no need. Mom's voice carried through the house as confidently as always, "We're leaving." I stood in the doorway of Bella's room, where the paint from her latest drawing was still drying on the windowsill, and rang the bell. Dad didn't answer right away. He paused, as if searching for words that didn't exist. "I know," I said. Silence. Then his voice became quiet, almost pitiful. "You'll regret this, maybe," I said, "but not today." The door closed behind them, and for the first time in months, the house no longer felt divided, just quiet, not echoing, not strained, but truly quiet. For dinner, Bella and I made pancakes. She spilled syrup on the counter, and I didn't care. The sticky sweetness spread, and I suddenly felt something heavy, old, lifted from my shoulders. When she looked up and asked, "Is it just us now?" I said, "Yes, it's just us." She grinned, maturely, as if she finally understood what home was. Okay. 2 days later, a letter arrived, short, formal, with a coat of arms. "Thank you for your cooperation. After reviewing, we have found no issues and are closing the case. No further action is required." I read it twice, as if afraid the words would disappear if I blinked, then forwarded it to my husband. I sat down on the sofa, exhaled, and let all the pent-up tension drain away, dissolve. Bella sat down next to me, her shoulder pressed against mine, a notebook full of uneven lists and crooked crowns, and rested her head on my hand. We watched the raindrops trickle down the windows, lazy, aimless. This time, there was nothing to fix. I hear silence, she whispered. Me too, I said, and for the first time in weeks I felt at home, not in a home built on pandering and wine, but in a home that breathed with me. 6 months passed, and the silence became constant, like a new order. No phone calls, no birthday invitations, no just stopping by. Contact with my parents and sister dissolved, and frankly, that post was worth every ounce of awkward conversations and whispers behind my back. Rumors, of course, spread like water on sand, unstoppable. My parents expected my brothers and sister to save them. After all, they had spent their entire lives saving them from the consequences of their own decisions. But Paula, as always, was busy. Her house, you see, was too small, and Antonio, the golden boy, suddenly discovered the art of being unavailable. So my parents didn't retire. My mother now stocked shelves at the grocery store. My father pushed carts at the hardware store. I felt no schadenfreude, only clarity, the ease of understanding that the burden was finally no longer mine. I had carried them for years. Their expectations, their coldness, their resentments, and when I let go, they finally felt their own weight. The irony was that even then, they continued to idolize my siblings. Antonio is so busy, my mother said to someone. We don't want to disturb him, of course. God forbid you inconvenience someone you love. Meanwhile, life in our house finally became complete. Bella's adoption process was finalized last month. The hearing took 5 minutes, but the wait a lifetime. Now her name is forever ours. We celebrated with pancakes and a movie she didn't finish, falling asleep in the middle. I looked at her sleeping face and knew, this is home, safe and real, unconditional as breathing. And now that it's all over, when every crack has filled with new light, I ask myself if I've gone too far, or maybe, finally, far enough.